Welcome to Green Tea with D-Man, Antonio Salazar, Episode 1.2, The Early Years. Last episode, I gave a brief overview of the hundreds of years of rich history Portugal had to offer leading up to the rise of Antonio Salazar, from the Age of Discovery and Portugal's peak of power to the gradual decline of the kingdom. Today, we're going to roll back a few years. We're going to introduce Salazar and cover the years from his birth until his rise of fame through his university years, both as a thriving student and as a member of the faculty. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was born on April 28, 1889, in the village of Vimiero, near the town of Santa Comba d'Ao. While he would later thank Providence for being poor, the truth was that Antonio was born late in his parents' lives, and though he was the fifth and last child, the family was financially secure enough to have their children educated. Antonio actually was taught by a local teacher, José Duerto, who held lessons in his home since Vimiero itself did not have a schoolhouse. While noted as a bright student, 10-year-old Antonio Salazar actually scored a rather low 10 out of 20 on his written examination, but he did excel in the oral examination with an 18 out of 20. When he was informed of his scores, it is said that he painfully remarked how he could have earned a distinction on this examination. The boy was lamenting what he felt was a missed opportunity, though it would be one of only a minute few which he would miss in life. Nonetheless, this episode is emblematic of how tough Salazar could be on himself. Later on, Salazar's sister, Marta, would claim that young Antonio was extremely kind, but that he did not play much like other boys, and instead he preferred to go for long walks with his dog, Dao. He was shy but affectionate and had a very close relationship with his mother. Interestingly, this shy and timid boy ended up making many lifelong friends during his early years at the Viseu Seminary and the university, friends which he would bring with him into the Estado Novo, as we will discuss in later episodes. Now, since there was no school in Vimiero, and the one in Santa Comba d'Ao was overcrowded, Antonio was sent to the home of José Duerto. And José Duerto provided national exam preparation for 30 or so children in the area. Now, due to financial restrictions on the Salazar family, it was decided the best way forward for Antonio's education would be through the Portuguese seminary system. Now, at this time in Portugal, before the overthrow of the monarchy by the Republicans, the government actually was paying the salaries for priests, of which there were about 2,000. Thus, in the year 1900, at age 11, Antonio Salazar embarked on studies at the Viseu Seminary in the district capital of Viseu. By 1905, Salazar had finished what was known as the preparatory cycle, earning strong marks in the arts such as French, Portuguese, and history. For the next 3 years, he worked towards completion of his theological studies, and he finished first in his class in 1908 with an average mark of 16 out of 20. Now at this point, let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of an 18-year-old Antonio Salazar attending the Catholic Viseu Seminary. The Republicans in Portugal were seeking to overthrow the whole monarchical system, to include the Jesuit clerical foundation that was supportive of king and country. As Salazar would later say, one cannot be religious in church and an atheist before the ballot box. Thus, it was 2 weeks after the assassination of King Carlos that seminarian Antonio Salazar wrote this meditation on the power of prayer. Look, Lord, at the sons of darkness, who, it seems, are vanquishing the sons of light. Look at the calamities that afflict us. Look at the patria, which expires. Look at Portugal's agony. Heed, Lord, the prayers of so many souls who are dear to you. Listen to their pained cry, their fervent plea, which ascends to your throne of all Portuguese hearts. Lord, Lord, save Portugal. 1908 marked the year which Salazar's political blueprint began to be sketched out. Instead of the path to priesthood and full ordainment, Salazar instead chose to take the academic route, and he moved on to become a teacher at the Viseu Religious Secondary School, Via Sacra, located within walking distance of the Viseu Seminary. Thanks to his growing contacts and political awakening, courtesy of the February Regicide, Salazar increasingly took to publishing in the local Viseu newspaper, A Folha, and laid out a strong defense of the church whilst putting the Republicans on notice. Recognizing that the press was a powerful instrument in the ongoing political battle, Salazar would write in March 1909, There is a press that builds and a press that destroys. There is a press that educates, and there is a press that perverts. There is a press that upholds morality and a press that turns men into beasts. There is a press that discusses and a press that, rather than discussing, insults. Instead of forming characters, it forms assassins. Now, war without quarter to that press. War without quarter to that morbid element which wants to destroy everything. The people are blind. The people do not see. Or rather, the people see, but pretend they are blind. The people listen, but pretend they are deaf. Such blindness will cost them dear. Such deafness will cost them dear. Despite being only 20 years old, Salazar had a vision for Portugal's future, and it was one which blended the glorious past of Portugal with a rejuvenated and patriotic future. He recognized that Portugal was not going to be an industrial power, but that maybe with less civil servants and more businessmen, industrialists, and enterprising farmers with a deep love for country, then Portugal could re-emerge as a great power. He emphasized this view in a lecture given on December 1st, 1909, to mark the 269th anniversary of the War of Portuguese Restoration. No, Portugal must not die. It must live on for the worlds it discovered, for the nations it amazed with the splendor of its greatness and its heroism. There are no new worlds to discover, nor strange nations to fight, but there is a grandiose, peaceful work to accomplish. There is the need to shape citizens who will be as good Portuguese as the Portuguese of the 17th century were. There is a need for the Portuguese of yesterday to turn our youth into the glorious Portugal of tomorrow, a strong Portugal, an educated Portugal, a confident Portugal, a hard-working and progressive Portugal. Must we always love our homeland very much to achieve this? Oh, we must always love our homeland. And just as we love our mothers so very much, let us also love our homeland, who is like a mother to us all. By the summer of 1910, Salazar had made up his mind about his future. He would attend the prestigious and storied University of Coimbra. Now, at this point, I want to take a quick pause here and give a brief history of the university in order to set up the rest of this episode. Now, this was a monumental decision for Salazar, which would directly lead to him cutting his political teeth and also meeting friends who would be with him for the next few decades. The University of Coimbra was founded in the capital, Lisbon, in the year 1290, thus making it the oldest university in Portugal. And actually, from 1290 to 1559, it was Portugal's only university. After its founding, the university would spend 3 centuries moving back and forth between Lisbon and Coimbra and back again, until finally in 1537, King John III declared its permanent location within Coimbra. Due to its history and past predominance, the university was the center of political and social influence in the country, and most especially at the time of the fall of the monarchy when Antonio Salazar was enrolled. During this time, the university figured prominently within the up-and-coming students engaged in Portuguese politics. In 1910, the university had roughly 500 students, ensuring that the energetic and ambitious youth attending knew one another, and this would facilitate an old boy network to further their careers in later years, as Salazar most certainly would do. Some of these friends would be invited into government, but others would be allies of Salazar in other realms of society. One of these people was Manuel Salazar, who went on to become the Patriarch of Lisbon and the head of the Portuguese Church in 1929. Several months after Salazar enrolled at Coimbra, the October 5th revolution occurred, and Dom Manuel II was forced to flee the country for good. This coup ended 771 years of monarchical government in Portugal and brought in the First Republic. Now, this is the First Republic because Portugal was in no way clear of its political turbulence with the overthrow of the king, and you can probably guess at this point, overthrowing a system of government which was, in varying degrees, in place for over 700 years would not suddenly make the situation all peachy keen. Instead, it led to coups and chaos until finally Salazar rose to provide stability, as mentioned in episode 1.1. But I'm getting too far ahead here, so let's get back to the young and bright university student Antonio in Coimbra. It didn't take him long before he joined the Centro Académico de Democracia Cristã, or the Christian Democrat Academic Center, CADC. In this group, Salazar found most of his university friends, including Manuel Salazar, who had founded a newspaper au impartial, as a medium to defend the church against the rising anti-clericalism of the Republicans. The CADC was careful, though, to separate their defense of religion and the church from a defense of the monarchy, in an attempt to remain neutral, as the Catholic Church was doing with the fall of the monarchy. In April 1912, Salazar addressed the nature of education in Portugal, stating that if man himself was not reformed, then there could be no gain from constant change, since man cannot be changed simply by a decree. He would go on to say, "To educate is to give God good Christians, to give society useful citizens, to give families loving sons and exemplary fathers." In December, he would give his first detailed public statement on political affairs at the academics' opening session. To paraphrase here, man was at the basis of society, and changes in society could only come through education. However, such changes could not be carried out at the expense of the family, the first and most important source of an individual's education. The family was the social cell whose stability and strength were an essential condition for progress, and its defense was imperative for the state. Salazar would go on to say that work was more than a simple creation of wealth, but was itself a school of virtues. Ultimately, his goal was to demonstrate that Catholics should not hope for tolerance from the secularists and the new Republicans, but rather to demonstrate their importance and show that religion was not an enemy of progress, but instead a foundation to morality, order, and civilization. While the Christian Democrat Academic Center was gaining prestige at Coimbra, they were not the only group opposing the new republic. In fact, it was in 1914 that the Lusitanian Integralist movement would be founded, also at the University of Coimbra. Remember how important I said the university was to Portuguese politics? Keep that in mind. In addition to Salazar, the CADC and the founders of the Lusitanian Integralist movement, Portuguese Republican Party leader and Prime Minister Afonso Costa, also attended Coimbra. It's around this time that Antonio Salazar began a noticeable shift, one both politically and personally. On a political level, Antonio began to show a noticeable influence from individuals such as Charles Maurras and Gustave Le Bon. Now, Maurras is an intellectual giant, especially for ideologies such as integralism, national Catholicism, and he influenced many leaders, including our very own Steve Bannon here in the United States. Gustave Le Bon was just as influential as Charles Maurras, but more for his work in crowd psychology. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Vladimir Lenin, Theodore Roosevelt, and yes, Antonio Salazar were all influenced by Gustave Le Bon's work in The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. Meanwhile, on a personal level, Salazar was forced to accept rejection from a prominent family whose daughter Salazar had taken a serious liking to. Throwing salt on this wound was that the girl, Julia Perestrello, was the daughter of Salazar's godmother, and this rejection was based on social status. That is, that Salazar was from a lowly family out in the sticks, whilst the Perestrellos were a wealthy family and well-connected. While this didn't prevent Salazar from engaging in romantic engagements over the next few years, it may have played a part in a bout of depression he experienced shortly afterwards. And here is a bit of a spoiler alert, but Antonio Salazar never married, nor did he have any biological children. He kept emotional matters close to his chest, but it is interesting to wonder whether the Perestrello rejection, or breakups from some of his other relationships, formed a major factor in Salazar deciding to dedicate his life more to the patria than to romantic entanglements. In 1914, Salazar graduated from the university a year ahead of time with a final mark of 19 out of 20, where he instantly became a hometown celebrity, as this was an astoundingly rare achievement. Perhaps succumbing to the elevated pressure on him from his recent success in university, as well as worrying about the social repercussions of the Perestrello rejection, Antonio encountered serious depression and locked himself away from public for days at a time. In a bid to help Salazar get back on his feet, dear friend Salazar invited him to move into his house where he could refocus his efforts and carry out his new plan, ascending to the top of life at the university. His first move was to become an assistant lecturer at Coimbra within the Economic and Financial Sciences department. While Salazar was already known for his high marks and his intellectual ability, this was the first step which would provide him with his clear opening as an economic giant to the nation racked by corrupt government, which had only managed to balance the budget twice in the last 90 years. In 1915, Antonio Salazar published 2 dissertations: The Cereals Question, The Case for Wheat, and Gold Speculations, Its Nature and Its Causes, which started to outline his economic vision for Portugal, arguing in favor of agricultural reform and a metallic currency. He was also supportive of a balanced national budget to show that Portugal was capable of paying for its responsibilities and to help the nation find markets for its exports, while tipping his hand to the point that a balanced payment sheet would not necessarily result in a favorable standing with the world. Salazar argued it would build a base of stabilization for the economy in the long run. For generations of Portugal, they had been forced to import most of its basic goods, which racked up an extremely lopsided trade sheet. And for men like Salazar, this would need to come to an end if the nation was to have any pride in itself. Now, the next 3 years saw Salazar shoot up the ranks within the university, as a combination of talent and sheer luck cleared the way for him. In 1916, he took over the Economic and Social Sciences section after the death of its sitting professor. In 1918, as World War I raged and Portugal was pulled in on the side of the Allies, Salazar was deemed unable to serve in the military and was elevated to professor ordinario at the university. The next month, in May of 1918, he was given the title of Doctor of Laws. During this stretch of time, while Salazar was moving his way up at the university, Portugal was undergoing, no surprise, political turmoil. With the outbreak of World War I, Portugal had decided to remain neutral, but at the egging on and pressure from the United Kingdom, the Portuguese had engaged German forces in its African colonies and in turn dozens of German and Austro-Hungarian ships. In January 1915, General Joaquim Pimenta de Castro, who had graduated from, guess where? Yes, Coimbra, took power under a dictatorship which only lasted until May 1915, when the Republican Party backed a constitutional junta and overthrew de Castro. Eventually, Germany had had enough of Portugal's antics, and they declared war on Portugal on March 19, 1916. In December 1917, yet another alumni of Coimbra, General Sidonio Pais, overthrew the government and declared a revolutionary junta. It's interesting to note that General Pais was an admirer of the German style of administration and military professionalism. As the war progressed and resources were sent elsewhere to fight the Central Powers, Portugal's failure to produce enough foodstuffs and goods for its own populace exploded into unrest. Salazar used the situation to publish a piece titled Some Aspects of the Supply Crisis, in which he laid out his beliefs on how the nation should manage the economy. His main points in this article were that Portugal should reduce consumption, dedicate resources to increase production, and build better infrastructure for the distribution mechanisms which the populace relied on. Despite the current war against the Central Powers, Salazar took the step of praising Germany's economic machine as an example of how other countries in Europe had been able to build a type of firewall which largely protected them against the massive trade and economic disruption caused by such a grand war. As Salazar continued to rail against the state of affairs in Portugal, he moved on from a macroeconomic view, and he ventured into purely political waters when he said, "The national spirit of decadent peoples weakens, which means that the awareness of links of solidarity fades or disappears, as if the common interest no longer exists. The sphere, which this sentiment encompasses, grows ever smaller, and it's as if a weakened heart could no longer pump the lifeblood to the further reaches of the body. It is the every man for himself of popular parlance. The nation no longer exists as a living organism, but rather as the inert sum of its almost independent elements." Not content with a simple shot across the bow, Salazar doubled down, and then he laid out some of the factors which supported this critique of the nation. Villagers across the country had collaborated in preventing foodstuffs from being shipped to other parts of the country. Meanwhile, production statistics were falsified, whilst hoarding was prevalent. Railway companies gouged both citizens and the government on prices, and workers across the country continued to go on strike in order to gain leverage for higher wages, which triggered inflation, and as Salazar pointed out, higher wages which would not drop once the war ended. While the private sector was ruthless and tearing the country apart economically due to selfish goals, The government fared no better, as it actively worked against the private sector, resulting in the populace as the main loser. To make the situation worse, Spain's neutral stance was providing an economic boon, as it took over an increasing share of the world trade market and providing the basic goods, which the warring nation so desperately required. Antonio Salazar was setting himself apart from the Republican government, and apart from the conservatives. He was beginning to blaze his own trail. And so it is here we will stop today, as in early 1919, repercussions from World War I and the Sidonio Pais dictatorship would lead to Antonio Salazar being fingered as a member of the monarchist restoration movement. After a somewhat comical defense of himself, which was enough to have the accusations dismissed, he would get his first taste of government. Until next time, this is Green Tea with D-Man.